Universal design is essentially how we recognize barriers to one size fits all and then provide pathways so everyone has what they need to be successful. Blended learning allows you to operationalize the research base of universal design because it gives us a frame for how we can provide all of these different pathways.
The topic of today's podcast is the shift to student-led through UDL and blended learning with Katie Novak. Unpacking Education is brought to you by avid.org. Avid believes that every student needs opportunity knowledge. To learn more about Avid, visit their website at avid.org. Welcome to Unpacking Education, the podcast where we explore current issues and best practices in education. I'm Rena Clark.
I'm Paul Beckerman.
And I'm Winston Benjamin. We are educators.
And we're here to share insights and actionable strategies.
Education is our passport to the future.
Our quote for today is from Dr. Catlin Tucker from the book we're going to discuss today with co-author Katie Novak. The Shift to Student-Led, Reimagining Classroom Workflows with UDL and Blended Learning. And here's the quote. The truth is that it is much easier to be a student in a teacher-centered classroom and much more challenging to be a student in a student-centered classroom. All right, Paul, you're up first.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of another quote that says the one that's doing all the work is doing all the learning. We really need the students to be doing the learning, so therefore they need to be doing the work. I remember when we used to bring laptops into the class, when it was the CART model and it was just kind of starting, and then the students would groan, oh no, the laptops, that means we're going to have to work today. and that's a good thing, right? Because we want the students to really be engaged and work through it, have that productive struggle and grow from that.
I totally agree with you, Paul. I hated the work day. But for me, I think this is like, I remember I work with first and second year teachers, and historically I've seen a lot of them center their life stories. Oh, Mr. Miss, what is that? Well, let me go on this 20-minute story about my life, right? And then all of a sudden the period's over and kids have done nothing. So that, I think, is a common trait that kids use to take teachers off track if they're teacher-centered. So really trying to figure out, really, what is the purpose of how you're engaging with students and why. That I was one of those kids, so this made me think back on my days.
What, Winston? No. All right. Well, I am very, very excited for our special guest today. We have Katie Novak, and if you haven't heard her name before, you might have seen it on a book or two, but she is an internationally renowned educational consultant, an author, adjunct professor at UPenn, and former assistant superintendent of schools in Massachusetts. Dr. Novak, she has more than 20 years of experience in teaching and administration and earned her doctorate in curriculum and teaching. And as I said, she's the author of 11 books, including the best-selling educational books that you might have heard of, UDL Now, Equity by Design, and The Shift to Student-Led. So welcome, Dr. Novak.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat today about some of my favorite things.
Well, I know we're super excited to be here. I actually had a colleague that was like, please, can I come join you? Can I be on the show with you?
And the person, did they make the cut or no? They're not here?
Well, we can only have 4 people on here, so she was willing to get up. Yeah. I'm like I said, we're excited to have you on here. And you recently released a new book that you co-wrote with another guest that we've had on before, Dr. Catlin Tucker.
Yep.
And that book's called The Shift to Student-Led, Reimagining Classroom Workflows with UDL and Blended Learning. So we're just hoping you can tell us a little bit about the purpose of this book and why the two of you got together and decided to write it.
Yes. So my work is predominantly focused on deconstructing one size fits all models for teaching and learning. And I do that through the lens of trying to universally design instruction. So how do we design a learning experience that is accessible to everyone, despite the fact that we are wildly different from each other and always changing minute by minute? So it's not only that we're different from each other, but that we're incredibly dynamic. And so it's so impossible, I would say, for a teacher to know exactly what a child needs without their participation in determining what that is. And so universal design is essentially how we recognize barriers to one size fits all and then provide pathways so everyone has what they need to be successful. And the most generic analogy I can give you is a dinner party, that if everybody came over my house for dinner and we had just a super diverse group of 30 people, I can't serve my meme's tuna noodle casserole because you're excluding anyone who is vegan, lactose intolerant, gluten sensitive, just hates the smell of tuna. There's lots of different reasons. And so I would want to move towards something more buffet-like, so I didn't exclude anyone. So I might have a pasta bar, encourage a potluck, and we can create this together. And a lot of people struggle with how to operationalize that because it feels like it's a lot of work because we're imagining ourselves in the kitchen making all of those dishes. So Kat and I talk a lot about that blended learning allows you to operationalize the research base of universal design because it gives us a frame for how we can provide all of these different pathways, but also have opportunities to work with small groups of students to help them self-assess, to determine if the choices they're making are in fact serving them as learners. So we became great friends, and we have another book coming out this spring, which is really exciting. And it's all about recognizing that teachers are working way too hard to not have better results.
So you talked about we're all different, right? And everybody is coming to us in a different place, and we're changing at the same time. So that makes it even more complicated. So what are for people who aren't really familiar with UDL, what are some of the components in UDL that we need to think about providing some of those different options for or with?
So it really starts with what are the barriers? So I was a high school and middle school English teacher for over a decade. And kind of the one size fits all model is here is a book, and we're all going to have a hard copy of this book where if we're lucky, it will have all the pages. And then we're going to read it at the same pace, and we're going to answer questions about it. And then we're all going to do a book report and hand it in some plastic sleeve that is totally going to get lost. And that's just how it rolls. So I would say, well, in a diverse class, it is very easy to predict that I'll have kids who are not decoding at grade level yet, might have visual impairment, might be multilingual, or might have absolutely no real connection or background knowledge to the text that I, as the master of all learning, have selected. And so when you hand out a hard copy of a novel to every single child, you are not guaranteeing their success in reading comprehension or being able to make connections with that text. And so when we think about UDL, we basically take the experience, like handing out a book, and say, what is the actual goal here? What's the point? Because the standards we're using don't provide us with a reading list, and they don't say how much students have to read extended text. And so I might say, we really chose this book here because I want students to understand how complex characters interact in a text. And that is not a foundational reading skill. So students could read the text in hard copy. They might decide to join a small group of students where I ask one student to volunteer to read it out loud so it becomes like an audible. I could have digital text so students could translate in whatever language they needed for their first read or listen to it. And you can provide all those options and choices to give every student a much better opportunity to actually comprehend that text. But then what I would say is, once we all understand that character interaction by reading or listening, then choose your own text that speaks to your own identity as a learner and start thinking about how those characters interact. So you can get an Audible, you can get an ebook, you can choose to read something by yourself, you can choose to read something with a partner. And explaining how characters interact is not a foundational reading standard, but it's also not a writing standard. It's a reading comprehension standard. So when students share with me what they've learned about characters, they might do that by recording their own podcast or making an amazing class presentation or writing an essay or creating this beautiful multimedia. So it's about firm goals and flexible means. And that feels like there's a lot happening at the same time, which is why we need some way to organize that. And that's where blended learning comes in to help UDL out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that firm goals, flexible means. That really hits home. And from one former English teacher to another, your example makes really good sense to me.
I really, again, I agree with Paul that the example makes sense. And I hear you specifically talking about how the process of teachers' normal thinking about their lesson engages with UDL anyway. So if you're in that, so continue to do that work. One of the questions that I have is like, a lot of times people hear and in education is like buzzwords. Sometimes you don't really know what the buzzword means. You're just hearing and regurgitating the buzzwords. So as someone who I think might have some knowledge of these buzzwords, if you could give me, in our show, we've discussed like different types of ways of blended learning, flipping the classroom, station rotation, playlist models. Could you give us a way of understanding how the concepts of UDL and blended learning work together? Since, again, so many buzzies, right?
Okay, perfect. So I'll leave my ELA world, which I would love to stay in forever for all the English language arts teachers, but not everyone is an English language arts teacher. So let's jump to math, for example. And a traditional math class, as many of us probably experienced it, was we get in, the teacher goes up at the board and does all the math for us while we sit quietly and patiently and sponge all of this information in. Mm-hmm. And then we are given opportunities to practice, which is often a worksheet where we're all expected to work independently and answer these questions. And then we'll get another sprinkling of these for homework, as an example. So recognizing the barrier of passive instruction, very different levels of background knowledge, how difficult it is to maybe answer questions independently. The universal design reboot would be at the beginning of class, we put up a practice problem and we say to students, this is what we're going to be doing today. And I want to give you 5 minutes for you to build background knowledge on it. And this might mean that you want to preview components of the text, whether it's digital or online. You might want to review your notes for yesterday, just so you know where we landed and we can keep going. You could do this independently, or you could do this with a partner. And if you weren't here yesterday, come over here with me real quick. I'll catch you up. So there's these options for building background knowledge. Mm-hmm. Based on that, I would then say, okay, try to do the problem. And there's no pressure. This is not something that I'm going to mark. It's for your own self-assessment. And that will help you to determine what you need to do to learn how to do this. Some of you will recognize that you know how to do this already. Some of you might realize that there's some pretty significant gaps in knowledge. And then I can provide you with options to either stay with me where I can do some explicit instruction, or you can begin to work on it on your own. Or maybe it might be better for you to access like a Khan Academy video, for example, because you can pause that. You can do that at your own pace. We're going to do that for a while, and then you're going to have opportunities to complete the practice problems. And while you're doing that, you are welcome to use math reference sheets. You're welcome to check the answer key. You have options to listen to music while you're working. So it's like this really flexible, what do you need? But then I think people kind of panic about what if students aren't making responsible decisions for their learning. So when I think about blended learning, we think about how do we balance giving students these options to access things digitally, like your Khan Academies, like your online calculators and things like that, with those in-person talking with your classmates, using whiteboards, completing the math, and then that teacher explicit instruction. So if we were to take that math lesson and do it in a station rotation, we might say at the very beginning of class, 5 minutes to build your background knowledge. Then you're going to self-select into, I feel really good about this and I feel like I can start off independently, versus I am a little bit confused by this and I'd like a little more clarity, versus I have got this, I know how to do this, and I want to challenge myself. Those become 3 instructional groups. So as students are working through me, I am giving really explicit instruction for students who are like, I'm kind of confused by this. I am saying to the students who I see second, okay, you had an opportunity to start. Show me what you did. Let me address any misconceptions. How do you feel about the choices that you made? And then that challenge group comes across. Again, I can check their work, make sure it's accurate, ask them some higher level questions, and then maybe we all work on like a much more difficult problem together. So the online station is watch your Khan Academy videos, access your digital tools. Your offline station is work together in your group. Whiteboards, math reference sheets, sharing notes, having conversations. But then a third of the class, I am able to address any misconceptions, really push back on people's decision making. And that's that relationship piece. And then at the end, we'd come back together and probably do a self-assessment of how do you feel about your work in class today? What are you hopeful that you're able to accomplish this evening or tomorrow? And so it creates this really beautiful space for independence, for targeted instruction, for feedback. And, once that becomes the routine, kids are incredibly capable of doing this work. We often will push back and say, well, kids can't do that yet. And it's like, well, because we didn't even give them an opportunity to learn how to do it. At one point, I didn't know how to play basketball yet. And now I can slay on the court with my 4 kids. They don't stand a chance yet. They're coming close. They're all in junior high now, so I'm in trouble pretty soon.
Oh, watch out.
Well, I know us math people appreciate that example, and it just really shows that we're trying to shift the sense making onto students, so we're giving them more of that opportunity, as you said, rather than just a teacher sitting up in the front. So I appreciate that example. And I always appreciate the idea, if we always say, if you can just sit up there and you're doing direct teaching, then like you said, the Khan Academy videos are great. And I love that kids can slow it down, rewind, and go at their pace. They can choose their place that they want to go. And then you really have created that smaller class size we're constantly craving, because you get to be with that small group. You get to know your students better. But like you have to jump in and try it. So that's always my push. The things you say you want, you can actually do in this environment. And guess what, y'all? It's better for kids. So I appreciate that. I kind of want to connect back to the quote we had at the beginning. So the heart of the book that we're kind of talking about in this episode, there is a list of 10 ways that teachers can shift from that teacher-centered classroom to the student-centered one, as just discussed. So let's take a look we're going to look at a few of those ideas on the list. We're going to start with number 1. So shift number 1, from transfer of information to student discovery, just diving in kind of what do you mean by that and why is it so important?
So this is perfect, because right now I am talking about like, what is universal design for learning and how does that fit into blended learning? And you can learn that from me, but you could also learn that, honestly, heartbreakingly, from ChatGPT. You could learn it by reading a book. You could learn it by Googling, right? And I think that so often we're going back to pre-computer days where truly there wasn't another way to get it. And I want to honor 1910 because those practices made sense over 100 years ago, because there were not ways to access podcasts or go on the computer. We didn't have like these vast digital libraries. And so you were very much limited by the book room and the brilliance of the teacher in front of the room. And now the teacher can showcase that brilliance in very different ways by working with small groups and providing feedback and things like that. But at the beginning of a class, for me to say, I'm going to teach you about UDL, it's much more efficient for me to say, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to build your background about UDL. And then I want you to think about what are 3 things that you learned about it? What do you think the main idea is? And then you can rotate through me in small groups. And then I can say, okay, so talk to me about what you feel like you learned. What are some of the core components? And then I could say, okay, great job. That is a real focus, but let me add to your thinking. Or I want you to check out another resource because that's incomplete. Or I could say that's just inaccurate. and I want you to go back to the drawing board. And so in that, the cognitive load that students have to build to get the information is going to be much more rigorous than simply having me share what that is on the unicorn chance that they're all actively paying attention the whole time and can comprehend that, because it's pretty passive. So I think that we have to shift away from I can give all the information, or even that I have to curate the content. So I have a lot of teachers who will say, it would take me so long to find accurate sources of information. And students need to understand how to find their own accurate sources of information. So instead of me spending hours and hours of my night trying to find the perfect podcast or trying to find an amazing article, I can work with students instead to say, like, let's co-create a rubric about how you determine that something is accurate. And then I want you to try to find some resources. And before you even dive in, kind of take them through the self-assessment. So as a mom, I have 4 kids. I have 3 who are in middle school, and my son thinks TikTok is like news, like CNN. And I'm like, that like anyone can create anything on there. And he's like, but mom, if it's trending, it's true. I'm like, oh my gosh, who am I raising? Please stop. Don't say that. But like, I think that sometimes it's like, we have to create the choice board with all the resources. And one great hack is, as an English teacher, I do a lot of text sets. So I am not opposed to having a shared reading opportunity for students if it is not a crazy long extended text and it's high quality. So let's do a close reading of this component of, let's say, The Great Gatsby. I'm not going to spend 6 weeks of instruction reading that book, but like, let's take a close reading of one aspect of it. But now let's pair it with like some multimedia and some like really great current event news about just like the difference in kind of class and wealth, and right. And we pull this together, and the teacher does that. But instead I could say, we're going to go into 4 groups. There's going to be a podcast group. There's going to be a multimedia group. There's going to be a video group. And here is your task. Here's the theme of the book. Find at least 4 really high quality resources, and then together kind of argue it out. What's the highest quality resource? How do you know? Why is it valuable? Make them put it together, for goodness sake. So I think that our nights right now, which are spent prepping and curating, should be spent Netflixing and going to bed early. Yeah.
You got to get your own password, though. That's why I'm not down with the Netflix. Come on.
Now, there's a motivational carrot at the end of the tunnel there.
Yeah. And that's always that fear that they talk about, or teachers I work with talk about going in, and it's just biting off a little bit out of that time, but really setting, it's kind of like at the beginning where it's like teaching students how to pass in papers. It might take us 10 minutes, but you know what? The rest of the year, it's going to take 10 seconds.
Yep.
So in the end, we're going to save tons of time. So I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, and I love activating that student agency to kind of help in the planning and the creating of that class experience. They get ownership in that, and then that becomes more meaningful to them. Another
life skill.
Well, right?
Come on.
Well, you taught middle school. It wouldn't work with younger students. Incorrect. So my son, when he was in kindergarten, the teacher said, one of the really important ideas of kindergarten mathematics is almost like a base 10, right? Number sense within like a base 10 or going up to 20. And so, after painstakingly teaching all the students how to log on to a text solution, it's called IXL, but there's so many high quality ones. But like, it takes a while to get kindergartners on their iPad. This is your login. Here's the QR code on your desk, how to get in. And they all get that down. And then that is one way for students to practice their number sense. And the most amazing thing that she did is once they all had that down, she's like, okay, friends, this is not the only way to practice. So I want you to think about being really creative. What are other ways we can practice? Are there any ways that you practice with your grown-ups? Is there any way that you did maybe when you went to preschool? And so teachers ask the students, let's go around and think of other ideas. And, someone's like, oh, at home, sometimes grandpa just gives me a handful of stuff, right? It could be like elbow macaroni. It could be pennies, and you could count and see how high you can count. And it's helpful if you have like a number chart, because then you can go 1-to-1 correspondence. Someone else says, oh, I like to make worksheets sometimes when I play school at home. Oh, that's cool. Like, could you then solve them? So the kindergartners made a choice board with 4 things: flashcards, IXL math, counting things in the room, and then making and trading worksheets and playing school. The teacher did none of it. And then she's like, okay, so, every day at the beginning of math, we're going to do 10 minutes and you can choose one of these 4 things. And then for the next couple of weeks, every morning it was, okay, what are you going to choose and why are you going to choose it today? And at the end of it, do you feel like you made a good choice? And look, it was just so brilliantly done. And they're 4 or they're 5.
I love that example, because sometimes we do hear people say, oh, those young kids can't do it. And that is not true. They can. So another place that sometimes teachers are hesitant to release some of the control is in classroom discussions. And I know part of your book, you talk about how you release that from a teacher-guided discussion all the time to something where students can kind of be in control of that. How do we make that happen?
So goodness gracious. So I teach like brilliant adults. I work with educators. And if I stand at the front of any lecture space and offer a question, I could make a soundtrack of crickets in the night. I could like go online and be like the new like environmental. I mean, people don't respond well for, I'm going to pose a question and let's play verbal ping pong. And so I actually use everything in that chapter with adults who are much more likely to actually discuss than kids. And I always, when I work with teachers, I say, you pose a question and say to kids, okay, turn and talk. 4 possible scenarios. 1, very rare. They both talk about what they're supposed to talk about. 2, they talk, but it has nothing to do with the prompt, right? It's like, hey, like, do you think coach is going to let us out of basketball, early tonight? 3, one of them, the Katie Novak of the group, talks the whole time and monopolizes. And then the last is like, no one speaks to each other. And so one of the things that we talk about is like, provide students with a prompt, provide them with time to explore resources, build their background knowledge, right? They could go on Google, they could go on ChatGPT, then have every student in the class pose 2 or 3 questions. And that becomes like an informal assessment for me, because I can recognize what they're wondering about and what they're noticing. And then we take those questions and say, okay, we have so many prompts now. And which way would you most prefer to have this discussion? So in my own professional setting, sometimes I'll say, some of you might want to take some time and really listen. And so we could do like a fishbowl, split it in half. Some of you might want to do just like chart paper where you pose the questions and then you all write your answers on Post-its, walk around, and then have a discussion about what did you notice about the trends. Other people might want to do something a little more traditional where there's like a manager and a note taker. So not only do they pose their own questions, but then they choose which discussion strategy they would like. For each of those tables, there's instructions for one facilitator about how it works. And then I walk around the whole time and everyone is participating. Whereas if I took that hour and did a Q&A, it's just not going to yield those connections, that activity. But also if I'm asking the questions, I am making huge assumptions about what people want to discuss, which are always inaccurate or just not comprehensive enough. So it would be the same thing in classrooms, whereas provide time for students to reflect on their notes, to look at some resources, to craft some questions. Younger learners or learners who have some like linguistic support needs, we might offer a couple of sample questions or sentence stems. Once that happens, we provide them with options for how they would most feel comfortable having those discussions, because some people are incredibly extroverted. Some people, based on the day, aren't really in the mood for that, like having a conversation. So maybe we set up an online discussion board as an option. But I have seen so much growth, even in adults, in their excitement and willingness to be able to co-create that experience for themselves, as opposed to me coming in and requiring them to answer certain questions, which might not be important at all.
There's two things that I'm gonna try to engage in. I hear you saying one. So the first is I'm just gonna like highlight that, hey, teachers, you need to think about how you're assessing the students, right? Like you're giving them multi options of how to actually engage in this material. So you need to think about like, how am I judging the quality of what students are turning into me? So like that's just something that we want you to think about as well. And I think that's one of the engaging questions that we're gonna have. But we'll move to one of the other shifts that you're gonna ask us to deal with, right? So the last shift on your list for moving is from teacher project design to student-led project based learning, right? That's a very important shift. You've been pushing teachers around letting go. We talked about this on our shows multiple times, and we believe that this is a powerful approach to like actually engaging and looking at planning. How do we give students more ownership in PBL and take some of the load off the teachers while empowering our students at the same time, right? The cognitive load shift, if that makes sense.
So this was one of the best experiences I had as a teacher, and it was before we really talked about what is project-based learning. But one of the activities that I had done with my students, and this was true student-generated project-based learning by total accident. So I was doing poetry, and right outside of the school, there was like a courtyard area, I guess you could say. And so I was like, we're going to be transcendentalists. And, we kind of dabbled in learning about what is transcendentalism and how can people connect with nature. And then we're going to go outside and we're going to just take a moment and we're going to just like, what do we notice? What do we wonder? And we're going to come back and do like some found poetry. And they all went out, and basically my lesson got derailed because they were so mad about all the cigarette butts. So they're like, where do these come from? This is I can't focus with all of these cigarettes. And I was like, okay, can we just, there's flowers, there's benches, and they're like, there are cigarettes and this is nasty. So I was like, what do you want to do about it? Like, do you want to go back inside? And they're like, no, this is gross. Like, this is clearly someone who works here because it's in the courtyard. Like, this is disgusting. So I was like, okay, so then they started we need to do some investigations. And so I'm like, oh my God, I feel like it's going to get me in trouble, but I'm all in. So ended up working of like, forget transcendentalism. This is ruining the environment. And so they started like talking to the principal, and we found out that it was a lot of the like contractors and people who worked in maintenance and things like that would go out and kind of throw them there because it wasn't often used. And so then they're like, we should go count them. And I'm like, that's gross. And they're like, we'll get gloves. So they go down to like the cafeteria, they get gloves, they're counting all the butts. And then it turns into, now they want to research all about like the harm and all of that. And so I was like, okay, so you're learning a lot about it. This is pretty cool. What do you want to do about this now? And how can you show like what you've learned about research? And so they decided that they were going to contact local newspapers and media outlets. I taught 7th grade. They're like 12. And they're like, we need to get people in and show this. And it turned out we were like on the news, and then this like group donated all these no smoking signs that we could put in. And what was amazing is like, it wasn't my idea at all. And so what I think is really neat is like, what really are your goals? What are your goals? And for me, my goal was like, students will be able to research. They'll be able to communicate in ways that are relevant, authentic, and meaningful. And instead of me saying like, this is your authentic audience, I'm like, what are we going to do about this? How are you going to let people know? And it was one of the coolest experiences. And a part of me was like, I'm going to replicate it. But I'm like, no, that was their idea. That's not a project, that's their idea. And I think that so much of teachers are like, this is what you're going to learn about, and then this is going to be your project. You are going to go to this cultural center and give a presentation. You are going to write children's books and go to the kindergarten. And those are beautiful ways to involve the community, but that's not children's idea. That's our idea. And I think that the best question was like, here's the problem. What do you want to do about it? I think yields amazing, amazing opportunities to say, now let's put your ideas on a choice board. As a group, do you want to contact a newspaper? Do you want to contact a news outlet? Do you want to write to the PTA organization? Like, what's authentic for you and your group? And these kids were so amazing that my favorite part of the story was when the news was going to come to my classroom, they're like, I feel like we should play a game when the news is here. I'm like, oh boy, what's the game? And I used to play a word sneak game with my students. When an evaluator walked into my room, they would all have a special word on a sticker in their folder that they had to use to make it seem like we were all like uberly brilliant. And it was like a fun game that I'm like, don't blow my cover. Any adult walks in this room and you try to slip your word in. And so they're like, we're playing word sneak with the reporters. And I'm like, oh my gosh. But like, it was the coolest project. But I think, again, I had nothing to do with it. So asking students, what are the problems and what do you need to research about it? And how are you going to work together to make change? Like, that really is the power of those deeper learning experiences, which we circumvent sometimes with our own passions.
I love that. And then you have more time for, Netflix because the kids are doing the work. I love it.
With our own password, obviously. Yeah. No sharing password.
Yeah.
Let's make that clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get locked up or sued, yo. Let's get.
Yeah, no. We all have our code. So.
And we didn't have a chance to talk about all of the 10 shifts, so y'all need to go out in the book, get it, and you can read it for yourselves, or listen to it, or just close read part of it. But of the 10 shifts you talk about in the book, do you have a favorite?
My favorite is grading. Get rid of all the darn grading. So, I spent weekends grading. Weekends. Like, no, can't go to the club, have 210 25-page papers I have to correct. And that's bananas. So we talk a lot about the importance of co-creating rubrics with students, helping them find exemplars of work that would totally slay that rubric, and then really focusing more on self-assessment, on peer assessment, and first of all, moving away from realizing or thinking that we need to mark everything, but how do we create this culture of feedback? And I got to the point in my own practice where, let's say that we are focusing on organization of ideas or organization of writing. And so what I would do is I would take a really cursory glance at the students' papers. And essentially you think about these students aren't really organizing their writing yet. These students are organizing their writing, but in pretty generic, typical ways. The first thing is, the second thing is, and then these students are very, very adept at creating very subtle organization. It's very, very thoughtful. It's very implicit. So I kind of have three groups, and I'm not going to write a thing on any of their papers. I'm just going to put a code. I used to do a highlighter. So if you get a pink sticker, you're in group one. If you get a yellow sticker, they meant nothing except the small group that I was going to pull. And so I would say, the reason I'm meeting with you is that I want to give you some tips about organization. Your ideas are brilliant, but in order to get other people to connect with our ideas, we want to make them a little bit more organized. So I love where you're going with your paper, and I'm going to help you with the organization. And then I'm going to give a mini lesson. And then that group will shift, and then they'll go work on working together to revise. I'm going to give a very different lesson to the students who are it's very organized, but it's generically organized. You've lost your voice. So let's talk about how to do that more subtle, right? With the subtle, I might push for something else. But all I've done is put a sticker on each paper, and then I'm going to say, this is why I'm here with you. Read through your paper and write your own feedback and notice why I called you into this group. I didn't write a thing on papers anymore. And it ended up being that I was saving so much time on my own. They were having to go, okay, so this is what she's talking about. But the real kicker here is that when they had to write the feedback, they weren't throwing the papers in the recycling bin. So I'm like, well, there goes my Friday night, because they would look at it and I would spend so much time writing, but they'd be like, bah, I get an A-. Who cares what she wrote? And they'd toss it. But because I'm delaying a mark, because I'm delaying any sort of grade, it's just well, it's not there yet. And so this is what you can do to make it better writing. And we didn't talk about, well, how many points is that worth? It's just you are capable of more than this, and I'm going to let you know what you need to do. And it was just a really cool process for students to be able to recognize that on their own.
I love that all these things that you're talking about not only make it better in the classroom, but they make it a better experience for the teacher and the student. It's like a win-win thing.
Yep.
And you've given us a lot of specific practical things to think about. So it's perfect time for us to jump into our toolkit.
Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. What's in the toolkit? What is in the toolkit? What's in the toolkit? Check it out.
All right, Rena, what's something that you would like to add to the toolkit today?
So I'm putting in the toolkit. I appreciate your website. It's novaceducation.com. And I know at least my organization, we've done some of the ongoing self-directed courses that I found helpful. You can do this with others. So I know there's some different UDL now, intro to UDL, the playbook for school and district leaders. There's some coaching. There's some that are more instructor-led, but there's also some self-paced ones. So if you want to just know more, learn more at your own pace, there's options.
So I'm one of those people, I like thinking about things, my PhD and all that. I like the thinking of things. So this in my toolkit, one of the things I want y'all is teachers are already asking the common question because they know their students. This student won't get this. This student will get this. This student won't get this. You're already doing that. So what we're asking is to think about the systems you need. So how do you systematize? How do I help that student that I know can't get this? So I like that shift in the thinking about the weight of the work to the actual processes that teachers are actually doing. So I like that as a part of my toolkit.
Cool. I'm going to jump to another Katie Novak resource, and that's the book that we talked about today, The Shift to Student-Led, Reimagining Classroom Workflows with UDL and Blended Learning. I think it was released just this past November. Is that correct, Katie?
Sounds about right.
And actually, my district was so excited about it. My local district, they're doing a book study with school leadership right now, and they're using that to maybe plan out some future PD and such for the entire staff. So, do you want to take a minute and just anything else you'd like to say about that book? How can our listeners get a copy on it? Anything?
We wanted to be super practical about it. So in it, we talk about like multiple examples of how those shifts work in early elementary, in elementary and secondary. But any of the tools that we have in the book, we actually make available to everyone. So there's a QR code in the book. And anytime there's a template or a choice board or a playlist, every chapter at the end has a put this into practice section. And all of those things are available as digital resources. So I know that when I read a book, sometimes I'll fall in love with a template and then I'm stuck trying to make it myself. And all of these are examples that we provide. It will automatically force a copy of it, and then you can edit it on your own. So hopefully that helps to minimize the workload even more of trying some of these things in your own practice.
Awesome. And I'm assuming it's available at all kinds of...
Oh, it's everywhere.
retailers.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And independent bookstores, they might not have it yet, but independent bookstores are the best people in the universe, and they'll always order whatever you want. And please support your independent bookstores.
I like it. Now it's time for our next segment, which is our one thing.
It's time for that one thing. It's time for that one thing.
It's that one thing.
This is one thing. What's your one thing that you're still thinking about, muddling your brain? You're taking away with the conversation. I'm going to pass it to Paul.
I'm still hanging on that phrase that Katie said, we are all different from each other and we're always changing. That changing part is something that I don't know if we always think about that. You know, we realize we're all different and we learn different ways and we have different needs and we're at different levels. But that changes. It's not like we should be locked into one spot. We need to continually reevaluate that and reassess that. So I love that piece.
Rena, what do you
Yeah, it's very similar. Paul went first, so he got to say it. But
I'm sorry, Rena.
It's good. That just shows how impactful it was. So just thinking about how we're all so dynamic. But I think the other thing that really sticks to me, as I know many of us were coaches of teachers and coaches, is this idea, as Katie said at the beginning, this idea that teachers want to operationalize, but I love the idea that blended learning allows some of that operationalizing behind the scenes, but still letting students take the lead. So it's maybe a little better balance for mindset of that operationalizing of the learning.
I hear that. So I'm going to jump in before I pass the mic to you, Katie. One of the things that I appreciate that you're saying, and I'm going to continue carrying with me, is we are no longer sages on the stage. I don't care if you're getting your value from, like, my kids need me and I am the deliverer of knowledge. Get over yourselves. I think it's really important that we start remembering that, knowledge comes through all spaces. So I like the idea of taking teachers to think, where do they value or get their value from, right? How are they defining their value as an educator? So Katie, what's your one thing that's still in your mind?
Okay. Before I tell you my one thing, I just want to talk to a quick, Paul, you noted like we're unique and we're also dynamic. So I want to make one point about that. And then I'm going to make one more point. So I guess this is Katie's 2 points. So yeah.
2 things.
Breaking all the rules.
New song.
When we talk about like students are different from each other, teachers know you're going to have students who are not decoding at grade level yet. You're going to have students who are decoding at grade level, and then those who are significantly above or accelerated. And teachers are really good about recognizing those needs. And they'll say like that group of students is allowed to have audio because I know based on these universal screening assessments that they struggle with decoding, right? And those students are going to have more challenging text. And that's much more aligned with differentiated instruction, which is kind of based on data. I'm going to create these flexible groups and regroups of students and provide them with additional tools. And we can still focus on that in station rotation if necessary. But the part about the dynamic is like, if you were to give me a universal screening tool, I would have been a student who is reading at or above grade level, and I would have never had the option for the audio. However, I only am reading at grade level when I have my contact lenses in, when the lights are on, when I don't have a migraine, and when it's in English. So based on the context, based on the environment, I am somebody who may need the audio. And one of the things we say in UDL is what we know is necessary for some needs to be provided to everyone, because we're always changing. And as a kid, I would have felt much more seen if someone said to me, this is not a foundational reading task. This is a reading comprehension task. And think about how you're doing today. And you can read or you can listen. And I could be like, oh my gosh, I have like the worst migraine. I am so grateful for that opportunity to listen, despite what data tells you about my ability to decode in English when I have glasses and the lights are on. So like, it's really contextual. So that sometimes helps people understand that piece a little more. My final thing is people push back about change. What we're doing doesn't work. I cannot say that more simply. What we are currently doing is producing the system's current outcomes, which is providing significant advantage to some kids at the expense of everyone else. And when we look at who is the highest performing in a district, we can make a very, very accurate prediction based on student identity. So what we do doesn't work. So there is no alternative than to do it differently if we believe in kids.
So I would snap, but you know what I mean? I get that that's getting out of date, I think.
No,
but
I feel like
if y'all can't see, but I got my fist in the air. I got my fist in the air, people. I got my fist in the air. Like, you know what I mean? I'm down with it. Like, word. So
we need a video podcast, Winston.
Yo, that's what I'm saying. We do, because some of our actions need, but I truly agree that if those predictors are there and then people are saying the world is falling apart because education is working, why do the same thing? That is the meaning of but I appreciate that point.
Isn't that the definition of insanity?
Yeah.
Doing the same thing over and over again.
We weren't going to say it, Paul. You're just leaning on it.
I just had to be explicit for those that need it explicit, like me.
I think that's a good place to leave it. But Katie, Dr. Novak, we're so glad that you're able to join us today. And y'all stay tuned because we're going to have another episode.
Okay, sounds amazing. Can't wait to be back someday.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Education.
We invite you to visit us at avidopenaccess.org, where you can discover resources to support student agency, equity, and academic tenacity to create a classroom for future-ready learners.
We'll be back here next Wednesday for a fresh episode of Unpacking Education.
And remember, go forth and be awesome.
Thank you for all you do.
You make a difference.